Hello, everyone. This is Parrish Alford with the Daily Journal. I'm joined by Logan Lowery, our Mississippi State beat writer, and this is Double Coverage, a production of the Daily Journal. We'll talk everything Mississippi State and Ole Miss for the next half hour or so. Logan, how are you, man?
Doing good, doing good. We're down that home stretch I was talking about a couple of weeks ago. Last regular season weekend of baseball season, and next week's Hoover, and the week after that's a regional. And like I said, don't know if Mississippi State's going to be included in those last two things that I meant. Those last 2 weeks that I mentioned, but they do have that final weekend series this weekend coming up.
Logan, I bet they're going to be included in Hoover for the SEC tournament. I just don't see how they cannot. Maybe you've looked at it, run the numbers. Are they mathematically still alive? I'm sure they are, because Missouri and Tennessee play each other. Alabama's out of it. Missouri and Tennessee play each other. There's only one other spot that won't go. Those two teams could possibly not make the SEC tournament. I just figure, with them playing each other, that State's going to pick up ground on somebody, and they're going to be in regardless of what happens.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about gambling and odds and all that stuff this week, and the odds are in Mississippi State's favor to make the SEC tournament. And they hold the cards in their hands because all they have to do is win one game. Win one game against, but granted, they're playing top ranked Florida, so winning one game is going to be difficult this weekend. They do have the advantage of having it at home. So if they win one game, they're in Hoover. But there is a scenario that's still out there. If State gets swept and Missouri wins the series over Tennessee, that gives them the same record, and Missouri has the tiebreaker over Mississippi State. So that would eliminate State. That's the only way that State doesn't make it, as far as I know. But if Tennessee wins that series, even if State gets swept this weekend and Tennessee wins the series, State still goes to Hoover. But if State gets swept and Missouri wins the series, then State's eliminated. As best I can tell, like I said, I wasn't a mathematician. Math wasn't my best sport or my best subject in high school.
It wasn't my best sport either.
Yeah. I gave it a sporting chance. That's about all I've got. I probably do math on about an 8th grade level. So, and that was 8th grade my years going to school. So I don't know. But I did pass college algebra. It took me 3 times to pass it, but I finally passed that sucker and vowed I would never take another math class again.
Logan, I told my high school advanced math teacher, Miss Hughes, and every time I see Mrs. Hughes, which isn't often, she reminds me, or she tells family when she runs into them down in Denham Springs, that Parrish used to always tell me that he wasn't going to need this class. He wasn't going to need math. And, lots of times the things you say as a high school senior, maybe they change a little bit, but I will stand by that. I haven't needed a whole lot of math, and that's been a good thing. So, kids, journalism, hey, it's not a bad thing if math isn't your strength. Hey, folks, before we get deeper into the program, I want to remind you about the Daily Journal High School Sports Podcast. Be sure to check that out with Dalton Middleton and Brad Locke coming to you every Wednesday. It's Prep Rally. Be sure to look for that where you go to search for your podcast. A busy sports week, Logan, with some of the Olympic sports, as we call them, the non-revenue sports. Ole Miss tennis, both teams winning in the regional round. For the men, a surprising upset at number 4 seed Stanford. Ole Miss coming from behind to win that match 4-3 last weekend. So both the Ole Miss men and women continuing along in NCAA tournament play, as is the Ole Miss softball team, in spite of a one-and-done performance in the SEC tournament, losing to number 5 seed LSU. Ole Miss is in action beginning Friday in the Tempe, Arizona regional, hosted by Arizona State. Ole Miss and Arizona State matching up last year in the Oxford regional, so some familiarity there. But the Rebels, with not quite the momentum they had a year ago, going on to the NCAA tournament in Tempe. I know State's still alive in some things as well, right? Both of those, actually.
Yeah, as far as the tennis goes, both the men and women both made the NCAA tournament. The men hosted here in Starkville last weekend and advanced on. They'll go on to the Sweet 16. The women went to North Carolina, and I think they lost in the second round of that thing. The men's golf team is still alive. as best I can tell. I think I saw some second round action yesterday with that. The softball team, I was actually at the Mississippi State selection show. They had that sucker at 9 o'clock Sunday night, Parrish. I mean, I just don't know why they couldn't have got it done. I thought maybe some West Coast, tournament or something had to wrap up, and that's why they had it so late. But apparently all that stuff was wrapped up early Sunday morning. They had a couple of rainouts that they had to get done, but all that stuff was done by lunchtime on Sunday. I don't know what took them so long to get that stuff selected or whatever. But, yeah, I was out there. And State's going to be in Arizona as well. They're playing at Arizona. So I know that's, Arizona's known, University of Arizona is really known for its softball program. It was one of those first to kind of get on the map. So State will be out there playing in Tucson, and both teams will be in Arizona. But, that's kind of where State stands with those non-revenue Olympic sports.
Well, Ole Miss men's and women's golf are both continuing along as well, both having successful seasons. Really, the big news for Ole Miss the past week, Logan, was the passing of Billy Brewer. And we've talked baseball, and Ole Miss came off a big sweep against Auburn, unexpected sweep that really put them back in the mix for the national seed conversation. We'll talk about that a little bit, Logan, but it was at the end of that series, Game 3, working on a game story. The Rebels had just completed the sweep when word began to circulate that Billy Brewer, the former football coach, still the second winningest coach at Ole Miss, had died. He had been recovering from a stroke, had been in a rehab facility up near Memphis, and when I would hear about his condition, it just never sounded very promising, even though he was up there, out of the hospital and trying to get better. But Billy Brewer did pass away last Saturday. And, Logan, it just made me think immediately back to the time that you and I and others spent with him here in my home at Gene Phelps's retirement gathering a year ago this time. It was about, it was last spring. And, there was a day, and I know you hear these stories too, of sports writing when, writers and the people they cover were a lot closer. You hear stories about old baseball writers riding the trains with teams and things like that, and sports writers of a different era who would fly with the teams to away games. That's just not the way it is anymore, for better or worse. You can make of that what you will, but I use that to say that we rarely see the people that we cover in social settings. And it was really neat for Langston Rogers, the longtime SID at Ole Miss, and Billy to drive over last spring to, just kind of visit with us and Gene a little bit as Gene was getting ready to retire. Gene Phelps spent many years covering Mississippi State and Ole Miss. And I tried to get some folks from both places who are still around to come out that day. But Langston and Billy were the only ones who were available. We had some others available by video with some things to say about Gene, including former Mississippi State AD Larry Templeton. So anyway, it was a good day, but it was really neat to visit with Billy in that setting and have him kind of lead the conversation a little bit, just talking about big wins and different things like that. And it wasn't all football. It was never all football with Billy. He was prone to share his opinion on anything. But for me, watching just the news of Billy's death and the stories that have come out since then, it's good to see him remembered for his teams, remembered for the underdog fight, some of the big upset wins. Logan, I remember, growing up outside of LSU, growing up in Denham Springs, the Ole Miss teams, when I began following college football, had fallen off. They were not the powerful teams of the John Vaught era, and the Rebels were, struggling a little bit. And there was always a great rivalry with LSU. I would hear older people talk about it, but I'm thinking, it's a better rivalry when both teams win. And then it went through a period in the 70s and early 80s where LSU was really winning most of the time in that series. But one of the big wins that people talk about a lot from the Billy Brewer era, was that 1986 game at LSU. And I was away in Monroe at that time at Northeast. But I remember that game and remember being surprised. I wasn't following those teams as closely at that time as I had earlier in life. But, Brewers teams were prone to pick off games like that. It was Pat Dye who told me in 2015 about, a game against Ole Miss when, even though Auburn was not leading big at the time, he felt like his team was very much in control, moving down the field, about to punch in a touchdown that was going to seal the game for him. And then Ole Miss intercepts and runs it back, and the Rebels win. And he said that just really stung because he knew that Auburn had more talent and had the better team. But Brewers teams were prone to pick off games like that every now and then. And, this week is he is prepared for a memorial service at the pavilion at Ole Miss. It's good to see that on campus, because, there were strained relations when he was fired after a second NCAA investigation. And ultimately, there was his lawsuit against the school to recover some money that wasn't, given to him at the time of his firing. So really, an uneasy time in the relationship between Brewer and the school. It's good to see him, with this event, this memorial service on campus, and how things just really had kind of thawed in later years, and for him to be remembered right now on the whole of his accomplishments, the completion of his work as coach, and not just the NCAA sanctions. So anyway, Billy Brewer passing on at the age of 82, and he'll be laid to rest this weekend. Shifting gears a little bit, Logan, let's talk about baseball. Let's jump back to State and Florida, that series, and we'll come back and talk about Ole Miss and what the Rebels have at stake at Alabama.
Yeah, in State, like I said, this weekend they got the big series against Florida. Florida's, red hot coming in here, and the best team in the country. So it's going to be tough. And State needs some good starting pitching, and that's kind of what has been lacking for better or worse, the last month or so. Connor Pilkington, the State's ace, their Friday night starter, just for whatever reason, the last probably 3 or 4 starts just has not got off to a good start. Now, some of those starts he's been able to recover, kind of that 3rd, 4th, 5th inning right there. He's been able to recover and kind of right the ship. And, but for whatever reason, that 1st and 2nd inning has been, just awful for him. Now, sometimes he's kind of been able to limit some of the damage and left a lot of runners on, but he's thrown a lot of pitches in those first couple of innings and got himself in some trouble. Even at Alabama a couple of weekends ago, he gave up a grand slam in the 1st inning. So they need a lot better start out of their ace on Friday night. Ethan Small, it's kind of been up and down the last couple of starts. He did pitch a lot better last weekend at Kentucky, and he just didn't get any run support. State had a 1-0 lead throughout most of that ball game, and Kentucky scores 4 runs in the 8th inning and ends up taking game 2. So they took the 1st and 2nd game of that series. State actually bounced back with a huge 18-8 win on Sunday. Kentucky just ran out of pitching, and State took full advantage of that, just jumped on them early and scored a lot of runs. And so State should have a lot of confidence at the plate going in against Florida, but you're facing a heck of a whole roster. I mean, not just their pitching staff. I mean, Florida's roster is probably the best roster in the country. I mean, they just got guys that passed on, high, that were drafted high in the draft and somehow made it to school. It's funny how that always happens at Florida and places like Vanderbilt. They always somehow get those guys into school where, schools like Ole Miss and Mississippi State rarely get guys that are drafted early make it to school. But it works that way, and that's why Kevin O'Sullivan's had such success down there in Florida. Just the run that they've had during his tenure in Gainesville is unparalleled. I mean, he's on a heck of a run and has and is able to stack teams up against and that's kind of what you have to do in baseball. You have to stack those teams back to back to back, and you see it right now, kind of at Mississippi State and LSU. They haven't been able to stack those teams. It's kind of a down year. Last year was a really good year, And you see them kind of peaks and valleys type of stuff. But right now, State, like I said, needs to win one game this weekend to really solidify themselves in Hoover, and then you got to kind of watch how things go there, because you have to have a winning record to make it to the NCAA tournament. I think Mississippi State's maybe 2 or 3 games over 500 right now, so they you lose the series at Florida this weekend, you may have to may have to win that first game that you play in Hoover, so to advance on to the NCAA tournament. So we'll have to keep an eye on that as things go on. But yeah, I do want to add something about Billy Brewer before we move on too far in the show. I did enjoy meeting him there at your house last year. It's the first time I've ever met him. I grew up watching him because he was the Ole Miss's coach when I was born, and he was the first Ole Miss coach that I really knew anything about. And my grandpa's a big Ole Miss fan, and he was a big Billy Brewer fan. And I've always heard stories about Billy because we're both from Columbus. And when I got to meet him there last year or 2 years ago, whenever it was, I brought up the fact that I was from Columbus. And, of course, he talked a lot about the city and how things have changed there. And he mentioned a lot of names to try to see if I knew them. And I mentioned some names to see if he knew them. But there was just such a big generational gap there. There was so many decades between the time he lived in Columbus and the time I lived in Columbus that we just didn't know the same group of people. But it was nice to meet him there. I remember just talking to him there in your kitchen, eating some homemade ice cream and talking about that kind of stuff. He had some good stories to tell that day, and it was a pleasure to get a chance to meet him.
Yeah, and Billy liked my red beans and rice, Logan, and that's good for my ego, when somebody likes the red beans and rice. One other thing I will tell you, Billy is given so much credit for bringing the races together on his football teams, black and white. When you listen to his former players, black and white, that's one thing that resonates. So that those guys felt like they were together. They were a team, eating together, sleeping together. Billy was really good at bringing the races together. And look, that's difficult in the South. It's difficult at Ole Miss for sure. The checkered past with the Meredith integration, other things that the Ole Miss has dealt with, symbols and whatnot, and schools recruiting against them, using those things to recruit against them for many years. Billy talked a lot about that, but very good at bringing black and white guys together and creating team unity. So anyway, that's Billy Brewer. Talking baseball, Logan, you mentioned the strength of Florida, how the Gators have put those good teams together under Kevin O'Sullivan. Ole Miss did not have Florida on the schedule this year, and that's certainly that's a benefit, but that's just the way it goes every now and then. No matter what the schedule is, you have to take advantage of it, and the Rebels did that in a big way to this point, going 16-11 in the league. The sweep against Auburn was huge, Logan, because all this season, I've heard national observers and others talk about Ole Miss and the possibility of a national seed, but I just have seen too many flaws with this team, mostly with its pitching as it's turned out. But the Rebels have found a way to win in big games, especially, like the second game against Auburn with Casey Mize. And you see what Casey Mize has done this season, and he's the projected #1 overall pick, the right-handed pitcher from Auburn, and he had pitched so well against Ole Miss previously in his career. Well, everybody has a bad day. Mize left some balls up in the zone, but the big thing is when he did, Ole Miss punished him. They didn't just hit him. They hit him hard. They had 8 hits against Mize in 5 innings. They had doubles and home runs, and Ole Miss goes on to win that game in game 2 and go on to they went on to sweep the series on Saturday. Looking at that Auburn series ahead of time, I thought the Rebels were going to really have to work to win the series, but the sweep, to me, really put them back in the national seed conversation. So fast forward now to Alabama, you look on paper and see a team that's 7-20 in SEC play, a team that's not going to make the SEC tournament. And you would think this might be a time for the Rebels to let up and just coast. But there's too much at stake right now, because I don't think a national seed is guaranteed by any stretch at this point, not even hosting the first round, the regional, I think is guaranteed. Ole Miss has hosted before, with 16 SEC wins, and that's what they have right now. They have an RPI of 8, so they're going to have a strong case with the resume they have right now. But 2 wins this weekend against Alabama, I think, really could strengthen their case for a national seed and allow them to host the regional and then the super regional. They haven't been a national seed, Logan, since 2005. That was the team of those early Mike Bianco teams when Texas came in and won that super regional in Oxford. But there's a lot of work to do for this team to get to a super regional, even if they take care of business against Alabama, have a good SEC tournament, and host. This is still a team where the pitching is a little bit erratic. But against Auburn, the Rebels got 2 very good starts from Ryan Rollison in game 1, and then Brady Feigl, a career game in game 2, when he was pitching against Mize, which is kind of what you have to do in that scenario. Your guy has to set down the other team's offense, and that's what Feigl did. Not a good start from James MacArthur in game 3, but Will Etheridge was able to come in with another long relief appearance and really held Auburn down. And Ole Miss, took the lead in the 7th inning on a home run by Tyler Keenan, who's really playing well, and then put up 6 runs in the 8th and won that 3rd game going away, their first SEC sweep of the season. Logan, I'm not sure they sweep at Alabama this weekend. I could see Alabama getting a game, as we talked about last week. Alabama is still playing hard. They're 7-20, but they're motivated. They're playing hard. They picked off a game against LSU in Baton Rouge last weekend, didn't get swept there. In the first game in the series against LSU, Alabama was leading in the top of the 8th and then gave up a grand slam in the bottom of the inning. LSU comes from behind, wins that opener. This Alabama team is still playing hard. I know you saw them against State. They got a game against State, and the other games were close. Isn't that right?
Yeah. The first 2 games went 10 innings and could have went either way. State got 1, Alabama got 1, and then State kind of pulled away to win that series on Sunday. But Alabama was playing hard. I was very impressed with them. Going in, they had lost 9 straight games going into that series against Mississippi State, and I was expecting them to kind of to throw in the towel because they were just almost mathematically eliminated from the SEC tournament at that time, and you really didn't have a whole lot to play for. But that team's a lot better than I thought just looking at them on paper. They played hard, and that little third baseman I was really impressed with, Kobe Vance. He's good defensively. He's good at the plate, and I was really impressed with him. So they've got some players on that team, and as they get that turn, they've had so much coaching turnaround the last couple of years. Once they get that thing solidified, they may be able to get that program back. I mean, that's a pretty good program that's kind of been faltering the last decade or so. So they maybe get that thing back on track.
Well, you see this Alabama team right now with pitching that looks to be much improved from the middle of the season when they were really getting blown out. You see them right now in a lot of 2-run games, close games, extra inning games, several, as you say. So I don't think this is going to be an easy thing for Ole Miss this weekend. They're going to need good starting pitching like they had against Auburn. They kind of, they didn't have that against South Carolina. They fell behind and were nearly swept there, just 2 weeks ago. So they're not that far removed from that, their last SEC road experience. So if they can bottle up some of the pitching that they had against Auburn and take that momentum into the weekend, everything should be okay. But a lot still to play for Ole Miss. Folks, that's it for this week. We thank you for clicking in for this edition of Double Coverage. Be sure to check out Prep Rally for all your high school sports needs. And Logan and I will be back with you next week for another round of Double Coverage.